I developed 3 character designs to test their versatility and style. The first was too chalky and dull, and the second one was too clunky. However, the final one was perfect as it was neat and appealing. For my character design, I drew a sketch of my character on paper, then transferred it into Illustrator to trace over it. This is my first prototype with the chalky texture, and this is the coloured one which I much prefer. Through the same method as the character, I traced over a basketball court, however still keeping with the proportions of the girl. I drew it by hand and just duplicated the background fence, flipped both horizontally. For the majority of my animation, I'm using 60 frames per second because it isn't too choppy, it's smooth, and it's really appealing. These are my different tests of colour schemes. For my final project, I used the bottom scheme with inspiration from Adobe Color and the Powerpuff Girls. At the time, for scene 8, I needed to do a grid outline for the doorway, so I didn't know how to do it, so I created my own grid effect in After Effects. However, after I did some extra research, I realised that there was a proportional grid setting instead. For my scene 4, I wanted to create an echo of the ball bouncing, so I used the echo effect and played around with its settings. I also applied the fill effect and imported the ball illustration to replace the red circle. For my scene 6, I started off with an Illustrator path, converted it into After Effects and created nulls from paths. Then I used the trim paths effect to make the dot create a path as it moves. A problem I faced was that I found that my trim paths weren't actually following the path I created. I found the solution to move all anchor points on every path, then I redid it for all my other paths. I applied the drop shadow effect to give it more depth. Then I created a new composition and positioned the camera to move vertically in order to make the paths look like they were moving. Finally, I played around with the speed graph editor for all the paths to make them look more diverging. For my scene 7, on a coloured solid layer, I added the turbulent effect noise and the threshold effect to give the solid colour texture and definition. After playing around with the graph editor and settings, I applied the polar coordinate effect to rect to polar to make it spherical. Then I applied the luma key effect and blended mode to stencil alpha. After placing the pattern in the circle, I applied turbulent display to make the circle mask flowy. For my scene 8, when I first tried to create the doorway, the rectangle tool was symmetrically moving its vertices, therefore I couldn't create the shape I wanted. I fixed it by using the pen tool to create the shape. I duplicated the backgrounds and used the inverted filter, so I had 2 different dimensions. Then, with the ball, I played around with the graph editor until the speed was just right. I then pressed alpha inverted matte in matte tracking to make the doorway look like a portal. To give the two-way effect, I just masked each frame. Another problem that I faced was my doorway masking, as when it reached the center point, it was a slice. So the solution was that I edited the mask for each frame and delayed the background transition until the middle frame looked like this. I did do a mini test of replacing the plain circle with the basketball illustration, but then I realized it looked weird. I started off with 6 sides and created them into a cube shape. Then I applied turbulent display effect to make it look like spotty transparency for the cube to dissolve in. In Adobe Animate, I roughly sketched out each frame of the animation that I wanted and placed each frame 2 by 2 on an A4 piece of paper to print and paint over. Then, after printing, I scanned it through into Photoshop and used the Magic Wand tool to make the white background transparent. Then, placed it in a new composition and created an animation file by putting each frame through. From the plain circle, I added a null object layer and parented the shape to that null object. Then I separated the Y dimensions, then went into the graph editor to make the ball look like it was bouncing through moving the Bezier paths. I placed random dots on the screen, then went into its graph editor and edited it, went into horizontal to view to move the paths backwards. Then I applied a radial blur effect and scratched a center zoom and curves effect and a matte choker effect to give it a more 2D thick illusion. I started by creating the eye shape and also creating the pupil shape. I then used set matte effect to make the pupil inside of the white of the eye.
I then went and practiced trying to move the bezier paths to close its eyes to make it look like a more realistic effect. My problem was when I duplicated the pupil layer of the iris, it scaled up and didn't fit perfectly under the pupil because the pupil's anchor point was actually not centered. However, the solution was either went Layer, Transform, Center View, and this centered the anchor point of the pupil instantly. I deleted the first iris and recreated it until it fit perfect. Then, in a new composition, I created the shape of a keyhole, applied each different layer of eyes, which I changed its color and slightly offset their timing, and then masked each composition to fit inside the keyhole.